This is Australian Agenda with Peter Van Onselen.
Hello and welcome to Australian Agenda. Thanks very much for your company. Well, the big news domestically during the course of the week has been the will he or won't he support an iron ore price inquiry. I'm talking about the Prime Minister. He gave very strong indications, at the least you could say, that he would, but there was a backflip in that respect. The man that started this off was Xenophon, Senator Nick Xenophon. We'll be talking to him in a moment out of Adelaide. But also internationally, one of the big issues of the week, decided just last night, in fact, was in Ireland. There was a referendum on gay marriage. They needed a referendum because it was in the Constitution that marriage could only be between a man and a woman. Well, they've had it. It looks like comfortably over 60% of the population have voted in favour of changing their Marriage Act. So that's an interesting one to watch in the context of what will happen in this country as debate continues about whether or not there should be a conscience vote in the Parliament on the issue of gay marriage. A lot to talk about in the context of the budget as well. My colleague Paul Kelly is away for this fortnight. I'm joined here by my colleague from The Australian, Troy Bramston, and we've got a special edition for you on Australian Agenda today. Not one, not two, we have four crossbenchers within the Senate joining us, three of whom are here live in the studio, including Senator Jackie Lambie. Welcome to the program. Appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Senator Scott Ludlam from the Greens. Appreciate your time as well. And Senator David Leyonhjelm. Appreciate your company. And as I say, we're also joined by Nick Xenophon live out of Adelaide. We'll be coming to him in a moment as well. Let me kick things off if I can. Scott Ludlam, the Greens have been arguing for gay marriage for a long time. Do you think that what's happened in Ireland overnight is likely to make it more likely that we'll see action sooner rather than later in Australia?
I really hope so, because it's not one of those things that you would normally say we'd seen sooner rather than later. I've been in the Senate now for nearly 7 years, and we've had a bill for marriage equality in Australia come on several times, and it keeps falling short. There were reports last week that we might only be 4 votes short in the House of Representatives, and that we might be able to carry a majority in the Senate. So I hope what's happened overseas will move things along. It's really about time.
David Leyonhjelm, I mean, you're the person that's been putting forward this private members bill on the issue of gay marriage. Can I ask you, before getting to what's happened in Ireland, about what has happened within the Labor Party? Tanya Plibersek and Bill Shorten are at odds over whether there should be a binding vote. I'm assuming as a Libertarian, whilst you're in favour of support for gay marriage in a conscience vote structure, you wouldn't want any party to bind on this.
No, it should be a conscience vote for everybody, in my view. It's not a matter for forcing people to vote against their will. I didn't like it when Tanya Plibersek called for a binding vote, because it made the Conservatives in the Liberal Party say, well, if that's what Labor's going to do, then we don't have to go down that path. We can have a binding vote against it. So I wasn't very impressed by that. But I think what's happened in Ireland is going to be good for potential of my bill to get through and get a positive vote. There are quite a lot of Liberals who would never vote for a Greens same-sex marriage bill or a Labor same-sex marriage bill, but they'll vote for a Libertarian same-sex marriage bill.
But if the bills are no different, is that just because of posturing?
I'm presenting it as a different argument. The traditional argument is equality, and that doesn't resonate with them. My argument is it's not the government's business what gender person you're allowed to marry. In the old days, governments used to say a black person couldn't marry a white person, or a Catholic couldn't marry a Protestant, and a Jew couldn't marry a Gentile. Still, the government says a man can't marry a man or a woman can't marry a woman. So all we're really doing is saying get the government out of it.
Jackie Lambie, what's your view on this issue?
Oh, look, I believe in giving the power back to the people on this, whether it's on this or the elderly age euthanasia. It's about time that the people were giving the vote on that. It shouldn't just come down to our conscience, it should come down to every Australian's conscience and how they want to vote. So definitely a referendum for this one. Personally, to me, it's a sacred Christian religious tradition to me, and I'm pretty solid on saying when it comes to marriage, marriage stays between a man and woman. But once again, the power needs to go back to the people. We have an elderly population in here in Australia, and I'll tell you what, my money would be on, I don't think you're going to get the same result that was just happened over in Ireland overnight. As a matter of fact, I don't think you'll get the numbers. But that's just my personal view. However, like I said, give the power back to the people, let them have their vote. Let's do a referendum. Let's do the referendum. Let's see what the answers are.
Senator Xenophon, can I just ask you on this issue? I want to talk to you obviously about the iron ore price debate, which you've been in the thick of during the course of the week. But on the issue of gay marriage, in the wake of what's happened in Ireland, Jackie Lambie has just said that she'd like to see it as a referendum so that the people can truly decide. There's not really a talk about that yet, but you never know. There might be some move in that direction post what's happened in Ireland. What's your view?
Oh, look, firstly, I supported marriage equality when it came up before the Senate. I'll continue to do so. I got in trouble, though, when I glibly said that I believe that gays have every right to be as miserable as heterosexuals. But seriously, it's an important issue of equality. David Leyonhjelm's right. This is an issue, and he's reminded us of the absurdities of marriage laws in the past. Whether we have a referendum or not, if that's a circuit breaker, that's fine. I think that the best approach is that there be a conscience vote in the Parliament, so every politician has a conscience vote on this issue. After all, it has been an election issue, so I'm not against the concept of a referendum, but let's see whether the Parliament can vote on this and make a decision and bite the bullet on it.
You know, I think that the problem is that just because we have a conscience vote, Nick, doesn't mean that's what the rest of Australia wants. We need to know how Australia wants to vote. This should be taken out of the hands of us. This is a really important matter. It needs to be given back. The power needs to be given back to the people of Australia.
I was going to move on to the budget. I might start with you, Senator Lambie. There's a number of measures that are unclear in terms of their passage through the Senate. The first one I wanted to ask about is the pension changes. The government, of course, has announced a new scheme to tighten eligibility for the pension, a new assets test. This is supposed to save the budget about $2.4 billion over 4 years. Where do you stand on this one?
Well, at the moment, I haven't been able to speak to the Social Services Minister. I haven't been able to speak to Morrison. I'm booked in to see him Monday. I have had quite a bit of community consultation back on that. So I just want to see exactly where he's going. The tapering, I think, is probably a good idea, but I just want to make sure that I see it all in black and white. Yes, I'm still sitting in the middle on that.
Have you been trying to see him, or is this just more a case of it's sort of in the diary at that point in time?
You know, when he was the Immigration Minister, I had no issues in seeing him. I don't know whether he's just sort of ran out of time, but I would have hoped that he would have spoken to me a little bit earlier. But, you know, I'm not sure what the circumstances are, and I'll give him the benefit of the doubt, and I'll be looking forward to seeing him on Monday. Scott
Ludlam, has there been any change in the relationship between the Greens and the government? I mean, there was some suggestions coming from Liberals in the wake of the leadership change that this might be a new era of consultation between the two parties that have traditionally been anything other than seen eye to eye.
Well, we still don't see eye to eye with a lot of the things that they're up to, and I think maybe they're misreading where we've been all along. We've always been, I mean, we get sent here from around the country to negotiate on stuff. That's what Parliament's for. So, you know, particularly given that they've backed down on some of the more aggressive measures in last year's budget, I think there is certainly room to move on, you know, on some of the measures that we can discuss here. But it's not as though we weren't up for negotiation before. So
would that include the proposed changes to the pension in terms of tightening that eligibility around the assets test?
Possibly. We're reserving our position on it. I think Rachel Seward, who's very close to these issues and has been working on this for a long time, I think we're cautiously supportive of some of the measures. We've been arguing for a broader retirement incomes review because at the moment the elephant in the room being superannuation and its tax treatment. You know, this kind of narrow tweaks and fine-tuning of the pension might be all very well, and we've just got 2 weeks of budget estimates to test the detail, but it's in the context of some older Australians retiring into abject poverty and some being very comfortable, and that's not something that any of us should be happy with.
One of the issues in relation to the budget, of course, is we've got a situation where the major parties are often not seen eye to eye on most issues, so therefore it will be the crossbench that make the decision whether or not things get through the Senate. If the opposition doesn't see eye to eye with the government, it does come down to the crossbenches. I'd like to just do a quick run around, maybe starting with you, Nick Xenophon, as the person that's not here. What is your view in broad terms on the budget? What do you like about it? What do you dislike?
In 30 seconds or less,
You can take a bit longer than that if you like.
All right, I'll do it in 45 seconds. I think the small business package hopefully will work. I know some economists say it may not give the kick along that's needed, but I think it will have an effect of stimulating jobs growth in the small business sector. I certainly hope it does. I think that the tapering rate of the pension is something that we're just simply going back to what Paul Keating and John Howard were doing. We're having a tapering rate that is much more sustainable, much better than getting rid of average weekly earnings indexation of the pension rather than CPI, which is much less generous. In terms of the issue of family tax benefit B, the big reservation I have there is that if you cut the benefits once a child turns 6, you will cause all sorts of problems instead of the current threshold of 16.
But can I ask you on that one, Nick
plunge.
Xenophon, I've got to jump in, that the government have obviously tied that change to family tax benefit to their package that Scott Morrison wants to get through. So does that mean that even though you might like that package, you can't tolerate the way that they're looking to fund it?
Now that means we're back under the ransom and blackmail situation. It's great.
Tried that last
yeah,
year.
we tried it last year.
Look, I don't think that's a good way. That's not a good way to negotiate. I think the childcare package has a lot of merit to it. I agree with David Leyonhjelm. I don't want to be shocking David by agreeing too much with him this morning. But
It's a Sunday. It's a Sunday.
It's a Sunday. But there are some factors that the states have a role to in terms of unnecessary regulation. Of course, we want the highest quality framework for childcare, but some of the red tape that's been imposed in the last few years has put up costs unnecessarily, and that's something that needs to be looked at as well.
David Leyonhjelm?
I think the pension tapering will get through, probably with Labor support. Labor Party claims to be very, very strong on means testing, and the idea of arguing in favour of people with $1.5 million in assets being eligible for the pension would be a pretty hard case for them to make. So I think they'll probably support it so it won't come down to the crossbench. I don't think it's very good policy anyway. All it will mean is an awful lot of people rearrange their affairs so they remain eligible. Like if they put a few $100,000 into their house or go on a big trip to Europe or something like that, they can spend the money and then remain eligible for the pension. So it's not good policy. The other issues are going to be interesting. There is a bit of a denial still, in fact more than a bit, amongst Labor, Scott's party, and I think most of my crossbench colleagues, that the budget balance needs to be sorted, that our fiscal responsibility needs to be addressed. There just seems to be this denial, if you like, that we can spend more money than we bring in. I seem to be a fairly lonely voice saying that. Well, Nick, yeah, I'm not. I didn't include you, I didn't mention you by name, but you do vote with the Greens an awful lot, so I can make various assumptions.
How are you going with the Libs voting on yours? What's your scorecard with that, David?
Say again?
What's your scorecard with voting along the way of the line of the Libs, of the Liberal Party?
Yeah, my voting record was in the paper the other day, 70%. Yours is 50, I think. Scott's 2.
2%.
Nick's 30% with the government. Now, probably more.
To be fair, a lot of those figures relate to the national security legislation where David and I did vote. So that skews it a bit on the carbon tax, on the TPVs, the asylum seeker policies. I thought, on balance, the government had better policies.
Jackie Lambie, when you mentioned before, when I was talking about the government sort of, if you like, tailoring their new social security package to family tax benefit changes, you mentioned that that's them holding us to ransom again. What do you mean by that?
Well, what they're doing is they're giving with one hand and taking from the other, and you just can't with your Part B for a child that's once they turn 6, you no longer get that. That's absolute rubbish. We all know children get older; they cost more each year as they're getting older. So saying that you can only have this for all the childcare, but we've got to take this away from here, and I just don't. That's not very good. That's not fair. That's playing it off each other, and by hitting those areas off against each other is not going to move this nation forward.
But is your view that you can expand the amount spent in that area overall? Because of course the response to that, I suspect David Leyonhjelm would take this view as well, is that there's only so much money that can be spent, so therefore, whether we like it or not, you've got to find the savings at the same time that you find the spending.
Well, there's plenty of savings. There's plenty of savings in the budget. First of all, we can go back to the foreign aid budget. We can take more off that, and I know you're spewing about that.
They've pretty much done the foreign aid budget over as hard as they can.
We have the, there's the sale of the assets to states, which is bribe to the states. There's $5 billion there. Infrastructure, we're not out there. We're not giving these youth jobs. Tony Abbott was meant to be the PM known as the infrastructure king or infrastructure PM. And I just don't think he's doing that very wisely. So get out there, get that infrastructure moving and stop leaving it to the last 6 or 12 months before your next election to make yourself look good. That infrastructure, that $50 billion should have started nearly 2 years ago, and he should have been out there and he should have been throwing it out there.
Senator Ludlam, can I ask you about the Greens' position generally about the budget? Both Labor and the Coalition have what they think is a plan to return the budget to surplus. I don't think it's credible on either side, something that Peter and I agree on and have written about. But what is the Greens' view? I mean, should the budget come back to surplus over the forward estimates or another period? What is the view?
I think it would be very difficult to pull it back into surplus over the forward estimates because the revenue and growth projections, I think, in the budget are wildly unrealistic. And, the government's copped a fair bit of criticism for these heroic assumptions about how rapidly they're going to be able to turn the budget around. I think it does need to be brought back into surplus, but not as some kind of article of religious faith. We've put a lot of revenue proposals and savings proposals on the table to the government over the last couple of years. A few things that have sort of been mentioned earlier, David talking before about people just sort of shunting wealth into property to keep it from the tax man. We've got to have a hard look at that. Labor have indicated they're cautiously supportive of looking at things like negative gearing, capital gains tax exemption. Hockey ruled it out without even giving it a moment's thought. Tax concessions of superannuation, paying the diesel bill of the mining industry, extraordinary subsidies to fossil fuel industries to assist them to cook the place. There's money there. We could have a disagreement about where we could get it from, but it's not like there are no other revenue sources available to us.
My complaint with those proposals is they involve an increase in taxes, not a reduction in spending. We do have a spending problem, not a revenue problem. And increasing our tax burden just makes Australia less competitive with the rest of the world. We are competing with the likes of Singapore, which has half our tax rate. We just can't go squeezing the lemon any further. Already, the top 1% of income earners earn 10% of the income in wages terms, pay 18% of the tax bill.
And there are millionaires who pay no tax at all. There are multinational corporations vacuuming enormous profits out of this country and paying bugger all tax.
Well, let me ask you something. The good example is Apple. Apple designs an iPhone in America, sends it to, or gets it made in China, and then exports it to Australia and sells it to consumers here. How much can we legitimately claim of that is attributable to Australians? How much tax should we impose on Apple for all we're doing basically is acting like a shop here? There's a very poor argument for saying companies like Apple should pay more tax. They're obeying the law, they have costs, they're deducting their costs from their profits like any business does. You've really got to ask yourself, what does Australia do to deserve substantially more taxes from the likes of Apple?
Nick Xenophon, do you agree with that?
No, I don't. I was part of the aggressive corporate tax minimisation inquiry of the Economics Committee yet to hand down its report. I think the ATO Commissioner, Chris Jordan, the Tax Commissioner, made it very clear that some of these companies are being investigated by the Tax Office for their practices. There's now going to be a broader anti-avoidance provision in the budget, which I think is very welcome. Scott Ludlam alluded to it. BHP, for instance, had a so-called marketing hub in Singapore. $5.7 billion went through it. $150,000 in tax was paid over a number of years. That doesn't seem quite right to me. I take David's point, but I think there's also an issue of an aggressive tax minimisation using offshore hubs, and Apple has been funneling their profits $10 billion in the last decade to Ireland. That doesn't seem a very transparent way of doing it, and it actually hurts Australian businesses who don't have those sorts of arrangements.
All right, hold that thought. We're going to take a break here on Australian Agenda. We're talking to 4 of the Senate crossbenchers. When you talk to the government, sometimes they tell you privately that trying to get them to agree on anything is like herding cats. I'll get their reaction to that when we come back. Welcome back. You're watching Australian Agenda, where Troy Bramston and I are talking to Jackie Lambie, Scott Ludlam, David Leyonhjelm, and joining us out of Adelaide, Senator Nick Xenophon. Senator Xenophon, I know that you were concerned about coming on the program because you were wanting to watch Eurovision. In some breaking news, Sweden have won. I hope I haven't ruined your preset record for that when you get home. I know you do have to go.
Did ABBA? So ABBA won again.
Yeah, well, there you go. Maybe the new ABBA. But all right, let me talk to you about the issue of the week in domestic politics, which is your idea, I suppose you could call it, for a Senate inquiry into iron ore and the price setting of iron ore. Twiggy Forrest had been campaigning pretty hard on this. There were suggestions that the government were looking to perhaps support this because they see you as the new kingmaker in the Senate, somebody that can perhaps bring the crossbench together. How do you feel the way it actually all ended up?
I think my crossbench colleagues can test this. Every time someone says rubbish like kingmaker, it means the opposite. I think it upsets.
You lose power every time it gets mentioned, do you?
well, whatever power I had, there's a lot less every time someone uses that word rubbish like that. Look,
that's why you're shrinking.
I thought.
That's why you're shrinking, Nick. It's all that weight on your shoulders.
That's right. No, it's more like the bad trapezius muscle. Look, the situation is this. Andrew Forrest has put up a case that he thinks has been predatory volume discounting or dumping a volume of iron ore, which is pushing down the iron ore price. There have been some interesting comments made by the likes of Rio Sam Walsh saying, well, if some of our, quote, friendly competitors are affected or go out of business as a result of more volume in the market, well, that's just the market at play. I thought there were two aspects to an inquiry. First, how do we recalibrate? How do we face the challenges of an $18 billion hole in the budget with a fall in the iron ore price? In other words, what do we do about it? Because I don't think we handled the last mining boom very well.
But did the government tell you that they would support it in private before changing their position publicly?
No, we don't have to look at private discussions. You can see what the Prime Minister and the Treasurer said in a number of media announcements, including on Alan Jones's show a couple of Fridays ago. I thought they were going to go ahead with it. They had shown me some terms of reference that were not too dissimilar to mine, which were going to be, it was intended to be a joint select committee of both Houses of Parliament, chaired by a government MP, in all likelihood Angus Taylor, someone who's previously worked as a consultant in the mining sector, someone I would have been quite happy to have as a chair of the inquiry. But I think there were all these sovereign risk arguments put up, and
did they talk to you? Did they let you know why they've changed their mind?
Look, I think it was fairly clear. I mean, the Treasurer was good enough to give me a call on late Thursday afternoon, moments before the announcement was made that they wouldn't be supporting an inquiry. I understand that there was the idea of the Productivity Commission taking it away from the Parliament, looking at this issue, but that was pushed by the wayside. I mean, look, they're very good lobbyists, the mining sector. BHP, Rio, Gina Reinhart, they did take my hat off to them, my hard hat off to them. They did a great job of killing this inquiry, but the issues won't go away in terms of the allegations made by Andrew Forrest. And secondly, what do we do in the post-mining boom to make our economy more competitive, to cope with the rivers of iron ore revenue that just aren't there? Senator
Xenophon, of course it's not a bad idea to have an inquiry in principle into anything, because you can obviously examine what's going on. But the problem is, isn't it, that any inquiry is going to end up recommending some kind of government action, which could then have a negative effect on what is an open market, and a negative effect on investment, jobs and industry growth. I mean, because an inquiry obviously has got to recommend something at the end of the day, and there's very little things you could do other than to ask government to intervene in what is a private sector market.
Not necessarily. It could be, Troy, it could be a case of looking at having an effects test, because at the moment we don't have an effects test. This could strengthen the case that Ian Harper put up in his review for an effects test in terms of abuse or misuse of market power. I'm not saying there has been in this case, but this is slightly different from other cases. These resources are owned by the people of Australia, or the people of Western Australia in the West, where they are mined by virtue of a licence that the Western Australian Parliament gives, with an obligation to get the best possible price for those resources. All I'm saying is that an inquiry with recommendations, whatever they may have been, is not the same as government policy, but it apparently spooked not just the government but the opposition as well.
All right, Nick Xenophon, I know that you're keen to get back to Eurovision. You do have a pre-existing arrangement that you wanted to get away for. More seriously.
I've got a flight to catch.
All right, thanks for your time. We appreciate you joining us on the program. Thanks for that.
Thank you.
All right, let's continue with the discussion around the iron ore inquiry idea. David Leyonhjelm, what's your view on this? I mean, I suppose philosophically you'd be concerned about where it might go, but by the same token, I can't imagine that you'd want to get in the road of a Senate inquiry.
No, generally I support motions to establish inquiries. I think Parliament's role, well, Senate's role, is to look at things. It's a House of Review, and normally I would be in favour of that. I take Troy's point, though, that having an inquiry like this creates expectations that the government will do something. And philosophically, my view is the government shouldn't do anything. And you also have to be careful that Parliament is not being used as a sort of a tool to pursue one business interest. So Andrew Forrest's made some business calls. Perhaps he regrets them now. And in a way, he's saying, well, I'd like, you know, big government to come along and help me out here. We've got to be very wary of that sort of thing.
Scott Ludlam?
I think it's in dangerous territory where the majors, the iron ore majors, argue that Parliament shouldn't look into an area of public policy as important as this. This has shattered the West Australian budget. You know, the state's finances have absolutely gone off a cliff. The Barnett government is pretending they didn't see it coming, as though it was just going to carry on indefinitely. And it's demonstrated to us, and one of the reasons I think that we would have supported an inquiry if it had come through, it's demonstrated to us just how perilously narrow our economic base is in Western Australia and by extension the rest of the country, that we rely on one single low-value bulk commodity where prices are set overseas. I think the inquiry could quite usefully have dug into, you know, potentially the degree to which the majors here have no control over the price. You look at the tie-up between China and Brazil over even the last week to get a sense of how helpless we are in the face of these commodity movements. I would have, I guess, used an inquiry like that as a way of examining whether we should have a more diversified economy that's not so heavily reliant on bulk export of these commodities.
Do you think there should be government intervention in the iron ore sector?
No, not necessarily. And I think that kind of freaking out on behalf of Rio and BHP, the idea that it introduces sovereign risk if the Senate conducts an inquiry into one of the most important exports in the country is childish. It's absolutely childish.
On that I agree with Scott. It was a gross overreaction to say there's a sovereign risk aspect there. There isn't a sovereign risk aspect. It's a legitimate area for inquiry. My point simply was that it raises expectations.
Jackie Lambie?
Oh, the first thing is when it comes to sending inquiries and recommendations, I'd like you to go back through time and actually be able to level up how many of those recommendations are still collecting dust. It really annoys me. So I think it's about time we got bang, we got bang for our buck here when it comes to Senate inquiries, and not just doing an inquiry on that part of the iron ore, but also asking how and why we're not doing more value adding of our iron ore here in the country. And the other thing is, can we create a sovereign wealth fund with a part of the royalties received from the iron ore? So it's not just looking at one thing. I think we need to look at 3 or 4 different
sovereign wealth fund.
scenarios.
It's called the Future Fund.
Yeah, but I just believe that and that's going to run out. They're going to run short. We know this from the pensions. That's not going to keep going and going. No, but if you look at it in 10 or 15 years' time, we start paying all these pensions back. That may not be the case. So I'm just wondering whether we should be using some of these iron ore funds to whether that's top that up or have its own.
Instead of infrastructure or hospitals or schools or paying pensions or paying for welfare, you're saying instead of all those things, it should go into a sovereign wealth fund.
No. What I'm saying...
There's not enough money to do everything.
No. What's the problem? So we're going to have to make sure there is enough money to be able to do this in the future.
And this
is the problem.
So you want to increase taxes?
No, what I'm asking is for those terms of reference to be extended right out with this inquiry, and that the government is that Tony Abbott not backflip like he's already done and hold his ground, stand his ground. Let's have the inquiry. I want to know, the Australian people want to know, and we want more information about what's going on out there. That's what I'm asking. It's all about transparency. That's the Australian way, and that's what I want to see.
It's a pretty amazing example of the power of the iron ore majors, though, to be able to just make that call to the PM and hockey and flip their position 180 degrees. It's remarkable.
You can say the same thing, though, about the original positioning versus what Twiggy Forrest had to say. You know, perhaps his direct access to decision makers, and then we've seen the return of serve from the big majors as well.
I guess what I want
He's
to...
a very good lobbyist.
Well, it's not just that. Is it coming down to political funding? That's what I want to know. Are these decisions coming back to the political funding? So let's have a look. Let's open these terms of reference. Let's get the answers.
Okay, can I move on to a different topic? Senator Lambie, I wanted to ask about your new political party, the Jackie Lambie Network, up and running this week. I want to ask the three of you about your own political parties and where they're headed. Can you give us an indication about the strategy you're going to run for your political party? Will you run Senate candidates in all the Australian states and territories? Will you run lower house candidates, or are you simply focused on Tasmania? And does that include possibly running candidates at the next election?
I'll be running two senators in each state. That's the first thing I'll be doing, and I'm out there, and I'm sure the veteran community that's already going through the back door. I'm looking from veterans from Afghanistan or Iraq to give them a second chance at life and bring them into Parliament. That's what I'm looking for. So I'm looking for a full house on that.
So just on that, so are you trying to recruit former veterans to run as your candidates?
Yeah, I am, yep. If they're prepared to go out there and give their life for their country, I believe that what they could give back to the country in politics, it will be phenomenal.
And are you planning to run in lower houses as well, at least in Tasmania perhaps?
Not this time around, no. So we'll see how we go this time around. But you know, there's only a small amount of us that are doing the network, so we just want to keep it nice and tight and see if we can get some veterans through and give them a second chance.
The most important thing in politics, unfortunately, is money. Well, in terms of being able to run candidates, establish a political party, and so on, you need money to do this, advertising and so on, and paying fees and so on. Where does your money come from? Do you have an active fundraising network?
What we'll do is we'll do like a crowdfunding thing, and we'll be asking the public. I really would like to see the public putting in here, because like you've seen in the past when it comes to politics, that political funding can actually decide which way you're going to vote, and I don't want to be put in that position. So it's me to get out there and sell that and ask the public to fund me as much as what they possibly can, and we're just going to have to see how that goes. This is a new way of doing things. I'm going to trial it. We're going to see how we go and see how the outcome of that.
All important to your chances or your party's chances of success at the next election and beyond is what the Senate voting system is. Now, the major parties have come together, indeed with the Greens, to look at recommendations to change that. Tony Abbott has apparently said that you'll know when an election's about to be called, because it'll be just before then that we'll have this legislation going into the Parliament in relation to Senate reform. David Leyonhjelm, what's your reaction to that?
The Labor Party is telling me that they won't support it, so it will only occur if there's...
Who's telling you that? Because publicly,
factions.
Publicly, they've obviously backed this.
I have my sources. The Labor Party is telling me they won't support the proposed Senate voting reform because it would lock them into a coalition or an alliance with the Greens, and they're very uncomfortable about that. And so there would have to be a deal between the government and the Greens. Politically, that would be awkward for them, both for the Greens and for the government. So I'm not sure if that's going to proceed. But yes, I mean, the rumours are pretty strong to that effect. The thing is, of course, that the government's also got the issue of whether they will win an election to think about, not just whether they can change the Senate voting. And they would have to call a double dissolution in order to get rid of us ferals all in one go. And even that, and that's a big call too. So I don't see it happening myself, but it just...
Do you agree with that, Scott Ludlam? I mean, the Greens have supported the two majors on this in terms of the inquiry.
No, we were there first. The proposal to take our Senate voting system out of the hands of expert preference engineers and put it back into the hands of the voters is something we've been advocating for years. Very supportive and protective of the role of minor parties and independents, because that's where we came from. But we're seeing the process being gamed really expertly by backroom operators, which has very little to do with the person in the polling booth. So irrespective of where the proposals come from, and I tend to agree it's starting to feel a bit less likely, but we'll see where it goes.
Why do you say that it's starting to feel less likely?
I don't think the Prime Minister's got the courage, quite frankly, to call a double dissolution election. It actually, as much as he might be trying to wash the Senate out of independents and people who disagree with him, it halves the voting quota. It actually makes it easier for Greens and independents and people of diverse views to get elected. So, let him try his luck.
Jackie Lambie?
Well, I think that if we were to take a vote on those reforms, that the crossbench is going to lose out, because I believe the Greens, Libs and Labor, they're going to join forces, and this is what they want to do. They want to try and knock crossbenchers out. There's no doubt about that. We're really feeling the impact of that. I don't think that's a fair democracy, and we'll fight like hell to make sure the current system changes unless they can come up with something. But the only thing I will say, though...
We will fight like hell.
Yeah, we will.
But how is it... It's democratic to have backroom operators with very, good brains and good spreadsheets engineering preference flows that have absolutely nothing to do with people's voting intention.
What?
You were elected in Tassie without the help of those people. You got a good, solid vote. How is it pro-democratic to let that kind of gaming of the system carry on?
Look, I think, and that's why we need to send an inquiry. First of all, is a very small percentage of that vote, does that mean you can pass your preferences on? Should you have to reach 2 or 3% before you can have that? Does that mean these guys, you've got sometimes 200 parties on that Senate ticket. Does that mean that if you want to do that, you can't just get on the internet and get signatures? You've got to do it the old-fashioned way. You've got to get your boots on, get out there at the shopping centres and get a minimum of 1,000 signatures. Okay, doing that sort of thing, is there better ways of doing it?
I think for forming a parties, I'm a bit reluctant to say if you don't get a kind of minimum vote threshold, you shouldn't be elected. It's more about put the power back in the hands of the voter. The system is being gamed. It's it's being engineered.
We have that system, the recommended system in New South Wales, optional preferential above the line, and if it wasn't for the fact that 21 people have to be elected, the minor parties would be wiped out. When there's only 6 to be elected in a Senate election in each state, under the New South Wales system, no minor party would win. You guys would even struggle. It's just you don't end up with a diverse representative.
David Leyonhjelm, the other issue potentially, what do you think of if the government does support this with Labor and the Greens and the change comes through, is that necessarily in the government's interest? Because it would solidify the Greens as the balance of power party, and the Greens and the coalition don't exactly see eye to eye. Yeah,
that's an argument I've been putting to them, that they won't have a majority. They will at best have half. It'll be a log-jammed Senate, and they will be going to Scott all the time and saying, please, Scott, will you pass our legislation?
It'll only be log-jammed if they put up rubbish ideas. We'll deal with decent ideas.
On their merits, I know.
As we all do.
And for the first 9 months of this Parliament, after the election, we saw what happened. You didn't like any of the ideas, I don't think.
No, that's a reasonably fair summation. You didn't like some of them either.
No.
We've been on the same side of a reasonable number of votes.
But I'm talking about before Jackie and I came in the 9 months from September through to July.
They spent the first 9 months of their term in office trying to wreck the renewable energy industry that we've been doing our best to enable and encourage. So, yeah, we did have some disagreements there.
Right, hold that thought. We need to take another break here on Australian Agenda. But when we come back, we're going to talk about double dipping as well as various other measures in the budget. We'll get the panel's reaction. Back in a minute.